In the last episode, we took care of a lot of little odds and ends trying to get the car ready to drive. And this time, we'll be continuing to do a variety of work towards that goal. And one thing that doesn't seem quite right that we'll want to tackle before putting miles on this car is the alignment. It's kinda hard to show something like this on camera, but even just eyeballing it, it was clear that there was some significant toe out. If I had to guess, I'd say the tie rods were replaced at some point and it never had a proper alignment after that. There's no particularly notable wear on the tires, so I'm guessing it wasn't driven for a super long time after that work was done. For the time being, we don't need a laser precision alignment or anything, so we're just going to go with the tried and true tape measure method. To make getting to things easier, for now we'll lift up the front end of the car and set it down on blocks of wood. For all of my other vehicles, a single board will do the job, but this thing sits pretty low, so we need all the height we can get. Just do your best to make sure that you're on a flat floor and the two sides are an even height. As we lowered the car down, we noticed it wasn't exactly sitting flat on those boards, so we'll bounce the suspension and give it a few shoves to try to even it out. And that did the job and got us a neutral enough stance. It should go without saying that you are going to be rolling under this thing, so you want to be very confident it's not going to go anywhere. So the transmission's in park with the parking brake firmly set. Chalking the wheels wouldn't be a bad idea either. So now everything is reasonably accessible, but before we can adjust anything, of course we have to loosen up our adjuster sleeves. Each sleeve has two clamps on it held tight by a bolt and a nut. Normally all you'd have to do is loosen these fasteners up a little bit and you could turn the adjuster sleeve, but in this case they were pretty rusty, so we decided to take them off completely to clean them up off of the vehicle. And with both of those loose, we can see that the adjuster sleeve is already wanting to turn freely, which is nice because these things can get very stuck and that can be a real pain. We'll leave it where it is for now and jump to the other side to loosen that one up too. For whatever reason, these bolts are a little bit cleaner, but we'll still take them all the way off. And just like the other side, probably because these were replaced relatively recently, this sleeve turns pretty freely. But it doesn't appear that either side has any anti-seize in there, so before we're done, we'll try to get as much on the threads inside as possible. And after looking at it a little bit more, at this point I decided I wasn't happy with how flat the vehicle was sitting, and it needed a little bit of persuasion. Don't worry though, that's just for giving the wood blocks a few taps, and we're doing it as far from under the vehicle as possible. And after that, things are looking pretty good and we're ready to check the toe with the tape measure. These tires have really nice, clear, straight lines on them, so that makes this pretty easy. We'll have one person on the far side of the vehicle hold the end of the tape measure in one of those lines, and we'll line it up with the same line on the other tire, trying to keep the tape as horizontal as possible. You basically want to get the tape as high as possible on the tire without hitting any suspension or underbody components. And we'll be taking a front of tire and back of tire reading, so you'll want to make sure you're taking the reading from the same part of the tire each time. And the measurement taken from the front of the tire and the back of the tire should be at approximately the same height. And that's pretty much all there is to it. You're taking that front measurement and the back measurement and looking for a difference. If the measurement at the front is larger, that indicates toe out. If the measurement at the rear is larger, that indicates toe in. And if you subtract the smaller reading from the larger reading, that will give you the amount.
Say exactly 64.
That is 62 3/4. So it's an inch and a quarter off.
Okay. So, as expected, there's a little bit of toe out.
In this case, there's almost an inch and a quarter of toe out, which is quite a lot, and explains why it was so noticeable. So to correct for this, what we need to do is turn the adjuster sleeves in the direction that it pulls the tie rod ends together. Normally, as much as is possible, you'll want to do this in even increments on both sides to keep the steering wheel centered. In this case, the misalignment is so bad, I'm not at all confident the steering wheel was ever centered, and I hadn't driven it for long enough on straight enough roads to know that for sure. So we'll try not to mess that up too bad, since that's a little hard to judge with the tape measure alignment, and if it's not right, we'll come back and mess with it later. The nice thing about that is you don't really have to remeasure anything, just turn the adjuster sleeves in even increments on each side, and the centering should change without changing the toe. It's also easier to adjust this if you unload the suspension. Having the tires on wooden planks sitting on top of wooden blocks makes it a lot easier for them to slide, so in this case it worked out. But whether you're picking up and setting down the vehicle or just letting the tires rotate, either way you'll want to bounce it before checking it again. This can help things settle and kind of recenter where they want to be. Then we'll measure at the tires again and see how we did.
Okay, that looks like, what's the 63 and an eighth? Okay, we'll say that's 63 and a half. Much better. Okay, let me turn it a bit more.
There's still about 3/8 of an inch of toe-in, which is more than we want, but it's a lot better than it was. Ideal alignment specs will vary vehicle from vehicle, and it depends on the type of driving you're going to be doing. With steering box and linkage setups like this, there's always going to be a little bit of movement, so about 1/8 of an inch of toe-in can help keep things centered. And that's what we're looking for. So we'll repeat the process of adjusting and measuring until we have it where we want it.
Yeah, we'll say that's 63 and, I'll call it 560. 63 and 5/6.
And there you go. At least according to our measurements, that's pretty spot on. At the very least, it's much better than before, and should be good enough to get us on the road safely without instantly destroying our new tires. But of course, first we have to tighten back down those adjuster sleeves. And before we do that, we'll clean up the bolts. All we're going to do is spray on a little bit of oil and run a thread chaser over them to clean up the excess rust. It appears to have been mostly surface rust, as there's no real deep pitting in the threads, and I think we're fine reusing these. So we'll get both the bolts and the nuts cleaned up and ready to reinstall. The orientation of the clamps on the adjuster sleeves is a bit of a topic of debate, but it's pretty much agreed that you don't want to line up the gaps on the clamps with the gap in the sleeve. I'll usually put the clamps at maybe a 120-degree angle to that gap in a place where the bolts will be easy to get to. Then we'll reinstall our cleaned up bolts that have been coated with anti-seize. We also replaced the split lock washers on them for whatever good that may do. It's a good idea to rotate the inner and outer tie rods so that they're both at their extreme end of travel in the same direction. This guarantees that once you lock them together with the adjuster sleeve, there's still enough movement between the ball joints that nothing will bind up. Then we'll tighten down our clamp bolts to 168 inch-pounds, trying not to rotate anything else in the process. Generally speaking, torquing these to spec will get the job done. But if it seems like the clamp is bending too far and the ends are hitting each other, it may be time to reassess the situation. Even these relatively small bolts will have enough force to still clamp down after that, but you also don't want to bend things completely out of shape by tightening them down too hard. So it's best to just use your judgment here. Realistically, only one of the clamps has to hold on to keep the adjuster sleeve from loosening, but for a steering component, you want as much security as you can get. And once everything has been tightened down, we'll make sure the whole tie rod assembly can still move freely. When we rotated the tie rod ends earlier, this is that movement that we were making sure we would still have. And everything looks good, so we'll repeat the same process and tighten down the adjuster sleeve on the other side of the car as well. We'll try to leave the tie rod assemblies centered after we're done, since neutral is the best position for their boots. And we'll bounce the suspension again and take one last reading, just to make sure everything still checks out.
Yep, 63 and almost a quarter inch. I'll say it's 63 and a quarter in the front and 63 and 3/8 in the back. So that's about an 1/8 inch, that's about what I want.
And we're in good shape. Our toe reading is exactly what we wanted it to be. And if we go back and do another eyeball alignment, everything seems much better than before. Each side has just a little bit of negative camber, and just the tiniest hint of toe-in is visible. So we'll probably have to come back and recenter the steering wheel later, but otherwise it's looking pretty good. We'll set it back down on the ground, and we're done with the steering and suspension work for now. So that's most of the big stuff, and we have just a few small jobs left. And first up is the rear view mirror. Obviously, this is supposed to be attached to the windshield, and also obviously, it's not. This had fallen off before I got the car, and it was already sitting in the passenger side footwell when I brought it home. These mirrors are normally removable via this Torx screw. That locks the top of the mirror arm onto this little steel plate. This plate is supposed to be glued to the windshield, and as you can see, there's still a layer of adhesive on top of it. The trouble is, it's tricky to get things to adhere to glass, and this is a widespread problem among GM cars of this era. But if you're familiar with this channel, this should all be quite familiar, as it's the exact same problem we had on our S10 Blazer. On that truck, we had to re-adhere the mirror a few times before we ended up using JB Weld to do it, which is still holding it on to this day. So for this car, we're going to skip right past most of the normal rearview mirror adhesives and just use JB Weld. We'll start by removing all of the old adhesive from the mounting plate. The surface finish isn't the prettiest, but it's clean, and since we're using opaque JB Weld anyway, it's not like you'll be able to see it. Then we'll use a razor blade and goof off to remove any adhesive that's left over on the inside of the windshield. Then we'll give the glass and the mounting plate a final wipe down with rubbing alcohol. On the Blazer, we also roughed up the surface of the glass a little bit, which according to some sources could interfere with the adhesion of something like super glue, but for epoxy it would probably help. Either way, for this car we'll leave the surface smooth and see how that goes. We'll slot the plate into the mirror and kind of size it up, deciding where we want it to be. When sitting in the driver's seat, my head is pretty close to the top glass of the car, so we want this as high and out of the way as possible. Then we'll mix up and apply our standard JB Weld to the mounting plate. We'll position it carefully, then press it onto the glass. A little bit squeezed out the edges, and we'll simply clean that up with a paper towel to make sure it doesn't interfere with the mounting of the mirror. Then for a little bit of extra assistance, we'll put a piece of duct tape tightly over it. And we'll let that sit for at least 2 days before putting the mirror back on it. And when we came back to it a few days later, we'll start by peeling off that tape. Sitting out in the sun is good for curing this epoxy, but it also made the tape deteriorate a bit, so we'll clean up all the extra adhesive left behind. And to clean things up, we'll give the area one final wipe down with rubbing alcohol. And we'll do some delicate trimming of any tiny bits of JB Weld that squeezed out from between the glass and the mounting plate. Then, with fingers crossed nothing falls off again, we can take our mirror and slot it onto the plate. So far so good, and we'll go ahead and tighten down that Torx mounting screw. We'll align the mirror how we want it and give it a bit of a shake to make sure it's not going to fall off instantly. We can also plug back in the connector for the map lights on the bottom of the mirror. And not only do the lights work, but the mirror's position seems good and everything is solid. It's also worth noting that on the mostly clear windshield of the Blazer you can see that trademark JB Weld color on the outside, but the Firebird has this heavily tinted stripe at the top of the windshield which makes it completely invisible from the outside. At the time of editing this video, that mirror has been on there for over a year and it's held up just fine so far. So that about covers the majority of the things we have to talk about, but while I have you all here, there are a couple more odds and ends that we might as well cover. We went through the car and did a little bit more interior cleaning, and one of the things we did was vacuum it. And what triggered the need to vacuum the car was popping open the ashtray cover. Yeah, even underneath the cigarette lighter, it's pretty gross in there. But all that ash is oh so satisfying to vacuum up. We also got some universal cut-to-fit floor mats, and they worked out pretty well. The floor of the front passenger side footwell is a little awkward, so that one doesn't fit the best, but all the other ones fit nice and snug and don't go anywhere. One of the times we were cleaning up the car, we found this little guy hiding out. It seems like this car always has been and always will be a haven for bugs, but at least this leaf bug is a more welcome guest than most of the others, and we relocated him safely. In a previous episode, we removed this steel sheet that was covering the fuel pump access hole, and it's pretty rough and ugly, but for the time being we actually went ahead and reinstalled it. In the future, I'd definitely like to remove the existing rust, farther rust-proof what's there, and cover it in a more visually pleasing way, but this will do for now. Beyond the obvious wind noise and fire safety reasons, I also wanted to reinstall that panel so that I could reinstall and use the hold down for the T-top bag. We did find a T-top bag in the car, but that's actually not the one I'm using. A friend gave me the heads up that this 1982 Firebird showed up in a local junkyard and I went to check it out. It had seen, we'll say, better days, but there were still a lot of decent parts on the car. I took a look around to see what I could use and what I could learn from this junked car. The back glass being broken is unfortunate, but it did give me a good view of the hinges, which was helpful for visualizing how it was mounted, and that will be useful in a future video. I also really liked the style of steering wheel these had, so I went ahead and took it. As it turns out, I didn't have the right socket to undo the steering wheel nut, but a little bit of creativity helped me remove it. Since our 91 Firebird has an airbag in it, I don't really want to switch it out just for the aesthetics and feel, but this might be useful for something in the future. I also looked to see if it would be worth getting the T-tops, but these older cars use a different mounting system. This 82 Firebird uses a hook type latch on the outside of the T-top. Our 91 uses a pin type latch. So we left those on the car, and hopefully somebody else who actually needed them was able to get them. The emblems weren't in the best of shape, but considering our car doesn't have them at all, I went ahead and grabbed them off of this one. I think the emblems came off of our car when it was painted, and I guess they never made their way back on. Somewhere down the line though, I'd like to get them back on our car. We also found some motor oil in the car, and this amazing picture was attached to the sun visor. It's just about the most perfect 80s thing I could have found in this car. And of course, the way we got here was talking about that T-top bag, and I found it in the back of this car. It's pretty similar to the other one we have, but I like it a little bit better, so I decided to use that one. Once I, got all the broken glass out of it. We also went back with some silicone and greased up the hood struts and hinges. We really should have just put some regular grease on those hood struts when installing them, but it's better than nothing. We also eventually reinstalled the passenger side door panel. There were, however, few survivors among the panel clips. We'll end up taking the panels back off in a future video, so we'll talk more about that process then. And for now, that's pretty much it. Before digging into anything else, we should actually see what issues the car has, and really the best way to do that is to drive it. This episode has already been pretty jam-packed, so we'll end it here. And I guess in the next episode, we're finally going to hit the road in this car.